Welcome, everyone, to Current in 30, the 30-minute webinar series brought to you by the Current Consulting Group. We are thrilled to have you with us. To briefly introduce this series, each session is designed to keep you informed, efficient, and ahead of the curve. On the second and fourth Mondays of each month throughout 2026, we'll break down key things you need to know about workplace drug screening, from emerging trends and regulatory updates to best practices and practical implementation tips. If you missed our previous sessions, please visit our website, currentconsultinggroup.com, or our YouTube channel at Current Consulting Group to view those sessions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled Current in 30, a 2026 Policy Checklist. Is your workplace drug testing policy up to date? This presentation qualifies for half of a professional development credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. Today's presentation welcomes the founder and president of the Current Consulting Group, Bill Current. Among Bill's many accomplishments, he founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998. He is a former vice president of consulting at Employee Information Services. He is a former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education. He is a former director of the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace. He has authored 11 books on substance abuse prevention and drug tests, and he is currently a member of the board of directors at Endesa and board of trustees at the Endesa Foundation. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group.
Well, thank you very much, Greta, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. And just so you know, I'm advancing my own slides, so I did not give Greta much time to talk about the CEU information, but this is it. There'll be another slide at the end to give you a little bit more information about that. But if you're interested in it, we do offer that, and you'll be able to find information not only at the end of this presentation, but also in the email that we'll send out afterwards. So we're going to talk about drug testing policies and the things you need to be looking for in your drug testing policy as you consider, whether your policy is up to date or not. And we'll basically follow this outline that you see on the screen, this agenda. But I want to start out by sharing some information from the surveys that the Current Consulting Group conducts every year. So every year we do a survey of the drug testing industry. This will be our 28th annual drug testing industry survey here in 2026. We'll present the results at the Endesa conference in April out in Anaheim, California. And then later in the year, we'll conduct an employer drug testing survey, and we'll present the results of that survey at the SAPA conference, which will be held in Minnesota this year. So some of what I'm going to share with you will be from last year's survey or the year before. So one of the questions that we asked employers in our drug testing employer drug testing survey was, what are the biggest challenges to performing drug tests? And there were a lot of answers, right? It doesn't add up to 100% because they could pick more than one, all that apply. But look right there, sort of where those arrows are, sort of in the middle. Some of the biggest challenges are state drug testing laws, keeping up to date with those, the marijuana legalization issue and keeping up with those laws as well. And then just keeping your policy up to date, right? I mean, these are things that challenge employers to keep their drug testing program compliant with the laws that apply to them. And so what are some of the biggest challenges to performing drug tests? Having a compliant policy that's up to date. So then we asked the question, when was the last time you updated your drug testing policy? You can see that 39% said in the last year, the last month to 12 months. 27% said it had been between a year and 3 years ago. And 15% said it had been more than 3 years ago. In fact, 6% said they'd never updated their drug testing policy. Every year, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 bills introduced at the state level, legislation at the state level, that if enacted, would have a direct impact on workplace drug testing in that state. So it's very, very important to stay abreast of those developments and then keep your policy updated to reflect those changes when they occur, so that your policy and your program are always in compliance. It's just critical, because if you're not in compliance, you run the risk of having legal challenges to your drug testing program. Now, we asked the question, why did you last update your policy? And I'm bringing some results from the previous slide onto this one, but in response to state law changes and to comply with legal marijuana laws were the top two responses by far. And you can see in the box next to it, state drug testing laws and marijuana legalization are two of the biggest challenges employers face when trying to do drug testing. And they've updated their policy in response to state law changes or to the legalization of marijuana in an effort to comply with those laws. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through today's presentation. Now, here's an important question. How does your company measure the success or return on investment of its drug testing program? When we asked that question, you can see that the answers were kind of all across the board, right? But your policy has to reflect the things that you're trying to accomplish with your drug testing program, so that you know how to measure the success of your program. Your policy is really the blueprint for how you're going to achieve your drug-free workplace and how you're going to keep your workers safe through your drug-free workplace program. And so you measure the success or the return on investment of your program by certain priorities and objectives that you have, and those should be reflected in your drug testing policy. So let's talk about state laws and federal regulations and whether or not you've reviewed them to make sure that they apply to you. Now, before I go to the first slide in this section, let me say that one of the questions we get asked all the time, because we write dozens upon dozens upon dozens of drug testing policies every year. We do hundreds of them. And one of the questions we're most frequently asked is, I'm in multiple states, which state law must I base my policy on? And the answer to it is that you must base your policy on all of the state laws that apply to you. You could be based in Minnesota, for example, but also be in 15, 20, 30 other states. All of those state laws have to be taken into consideration when putting your policy together. So you're going to have a base policy, maybe based on the state where your company is headquartered, but you might have individual state addendums for the various other applicable states and what those state laws require of you when it comes to drug testing. Now, on the federal side, let me just say that if you have a DOT program, you're required under one of the federal DOT agencies, like the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration or the Federal Aviation Administration, you have to have a policy for that part of your company's program. You can't use your non-DOT policy for your FMCSA employees who are covered under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations for drug and alcohol testing, or FAA or FRA, etc. So you may end up having two or more policies, one for your non-DOT program, which is based on the state laws that apply to you, which may have different addendums in that policy based on the different state laws that apply. But you might also have a separate policy to cover your Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration covered employees, or your aviation employees, etc. When DOT comes to audit, and I'm speaking very generally, they'll want to see that policy, and they won't accept a non-DOT policy as your DOT policy. Okay, so very important distinction there. So when you think about the state laws that apply to you, here are some questions you should be asking. Does your policy reflect current state drug testing statutes and marijuana laws? Back in the old days, when I first started tracking state laws, we were really just looking at state drug testing laws. Nowadays, we're looking at case law development, we're looking at workers' comp regulations, unemployment comp regulations, we're looking at mandatory drug testing laws, voluntary drug testing laws, but we're also today looking at the legal marijuana laws that are out there in so many states now, where states have legalized marijuana for either medicinal use or recreational use, or in some cases, both. And in many cases, those marijuana laws will have language in the law, in the marijuana law, that affects the workplace. And so we need to be aware of those and have them reflected in your policy. And it may be that you have a separate addendum for a marijuana law in a certain state that has many restrictions, but you don't want to apply those restrictions to all of your company in all the other states that you're in. So we'll treat that one separately. Another question, have any new employee protections, notice requirements, or testing restrictions been enacted? I'm going to share an example in a minute from Minnesota. And if you're a multi-state employer, are state-specific addenda included where required? Again, let me explain. Let's say you're a company that's in California, but you're also in Texas and Florida. Well, Texas and Florida are very employer-friendly, drug testing-friendly states. You don't want to base your entire nationwide policy on the very restrictive nature of the California law when it comes to drug testing, right? And at the same time, you can't really apply the more employer-friendly laws that apply in a state like Florida or Texas. So you're going to treat California as an addendum to your base policy, and you're going to make sure that you're in compliance with any legal restrictions that apply in California, but not necessarily restricting the rest of your company because you're in other states that are more employer friendly. So let's look at some examples. In 2024, Minnesota amended its laboratory licensing law to allow rapid result oral fluid testing. That's a very, very significant development because we're seeing a lot of movement toward oral fluid testing. And I've got some slides coming up and I'll explain why we're seeing more interest in oral fluid testing. But in 2024, Minnesota actually amended a laboratory licensing law to allow for the use of rapid result oral fluid testing. So that's significant. If you're based in Minnesota and you want to do rapid oral fluid testing, you can. We would put some specific languages into the policy to make sure that it's in compliance with the Minnesota laboratory licensing law. But that's a significant development that may apply to your company. Now, staying with Minnesota, in 2025, Minnesota updated its marijuana law and added some language to the law that is very specific to the workplace that prevents employers from discriminating based on medical cannabis enrollment in a state or tribal, or cannabis positive tests unless use impairment occurred at work. This is an interesting development as well. And certain notice obligations now apply when federal regulatory conflicts exist. And so that's a significant development in one state. And if you're in Minnesota, it applies to you if you have a drug testing program. You want to make sure that your policy reflects those changes. That's why it's so important to update your policy at least on an annual basis or in real time if a state like Minnesota passes a law or amends its marijuana law in a way that could affect your company drug testing program. Want to make sure that you keep those things up to date. And this is just one example. There are many every year that could apply. Now, let's talk about your policy defining your drug testing objectives, right? I've mentioned that at the beginning of today's presentation. You want your policy to reflect what it is you hope your drug testing program is going to achieve, why your company conducts drug testing. Are you concerned about safety factors, and are those reflected in your drug testing practices? And then that third bullet, how testing practices align with the achievement of your company's drug-free workplace goals and objectives. Those are all things that you have to take into consideration when you're putting the policy together. So at the start of your policy, you're going to have what we call a purpose statement, and it's going to talk about some of the things that you need to take into consideration when putting the program together so that your program is designed to achieve certain objectives, whatever those drug testing objectives are. As part of our employer survey last year, we asked the question, why establish and maintain a drug testing program? And you can see right in the middle with the long orange bar, 78% said to promote a safe workplace. In other words, safety is the #1 response that many employers offer. Now, again, if you look at all of these percentages, they don't add up to 100%, right? It goes well above 100%. That's because employers could identify any or mark any of the ones that apply. But to promote a safe workplace was the #1 reason that employers gave for establishing and maintaining a drug testing program. So that's going to be reflected in your purpose statement, in your policy. And then the rest of your policy, your program itself, is going to be designed to help achieve that that key objective of a safe workplace. So for example, you may do pre-employment testing, right? Because you want to make sure you're not hiring drug users, but at the same time, you may also do random testing, because random testing is a very effective deterrent to drug use. And so those two testing methods can help a company achieve its objective of a safe workplace, which is going to be reflected at the beginning of your policy in your purpose statement. Okay, let's move on. Are covered employees clearly identified in your policy? Who does your policy apply to? Job applicants, current employees, only safety sensitive employees? Does it apply to remote or temporary or seasonal contract workers? And then DOT versus non-DOT. Now, as I mentioned before, you must have a separate policy for DOT if you're conducting both a DOT and a non-DOT program, right? You want to have a policy that's just dedicated to your DOT compliance. But in either policy, you're going to mention or articulate who the policy applies to. Is it all job applicants or only applicants for certain positions? Is it all employees or only employees in certain, like safety sensitive positions? Will it apply to remote workers or temporary workers or seasonal workers, etc.? Your policy has to state that, so that individuals who work for your company or who are applying for a job with your company will know for sure whether they're going to be subject to drug testing. So keep that in mind as you put your program together, that you clearly articulate who the policy applies to. Now, the next section, does the policy reflect current testing methods? Have you changed how you conduct drug testing? Or are you considering adding a different drug testing method to your program to take advantage of new technology? And does your policy reflect that? Are you testing urine, oral fluid, hair? Your policy has to state which or the combination of specimens that you use as part of your program. Where do collections take place? Are they at off-site facilities, or are they taking place in-house? With oral fluid testing, that's a very common option, to be able to do the test on-site with trained employees conducting the test. Whereas with urine, you're typically either going to have a professional collector come to your work site, or you're going to send your employees to an off-site facility where a professional will conduct the collection. Okay, all of these things, including the testing circumstances of when tests will take place, must be explained in the policy. So again, let's refer to our current consulting group employer survey. What drug testing methods do you currently use? You're probably not going to find this surprising at all, but the vast majority said lab-based urine testing. 46% said instant urine testing, but it's interesting to me that a combined 50% indicated instant oral fluid or lab-based oral fluid testing. 20 years ago, that would have been 5%, 8% maybe at the most. Now it's 50% of employers saying that they use some form of oral fluid testing. And then when we ask the question, do you plan on adding a testing methodology? You can see that a combined 31% said either lab-based oral fluid testing or instant oral fluid testing. And I bring that up because oral fluid testing has sort of been like the ultimate emerging technology in the drug testing world for many years. But not too many years ago, the U.S. Department of Transportation added oral fluid testing to the regulations to allow covered employers to use lab-based oral fluid testing in addition to or in place of lab-based urine testing. Now, we're still waiting for those regulations to go into effect. They're not effective right now. You can't use lab-based oral fluid testing yet in your DOT program. Or by the time you listen to this webinar sometime in the future, maybe you're listening to it, maybe it's become useful by then. But the fact is, once DOT sort of gave its good housekeeping seal of approval to oral fluid testing, lab-based in particular, then we started seeing a lot of interest in oral fluid testing, to the point now where on the previous slide, 50% of employers say they're already using some form of oral fluid testing, and 31% said they're considering adding some form of oral fluid testing. Well, this gets written into your policy, so your employees know exactly how you conduct drug testing and any other expectations that may be related to it, how collections take place, which drugs you test for, etc. That all gets put into your policy. Now, another one, very important, as I talked about, are the marijuana provisions and you want to make sure that your policy is up to date with the state laws that apply to you when it comes to marijuana. And so many states now have legalized some form of marijuana use, and you want your policy to reflect those. And so you probably will want to have a dedicated marijuana section in your policy. As I mentioned, 20, 25 years ago, we never talked about it that way. But now you have to, because so many states have moved to legalize either medicinal marijuana use or recreational marijuana use. And so you're going to want to have a section of your policy and perhaps individual state addendums that reflect the marijuana laws that apply to your company. And that's going to depend on the states that you're in. Now, we did ask the question in our survey, due to the legalization of marijuana, how concerned are you about? And you can see that up at the top, 59% said they're very concerned about safety, and 34% said they're at least a little concerned about safety. So that's a big number, 93%, right, that are concerned about the legal marijuana's effect on workplace safety. And when you think back earlier in today's presentation, that's the #1 objective or reason or motivation for conducting drug testing, to promote a safe workplace. And so it's natural that employers would be concerned about legal marijuana's effect on safety in the workplace. We also asked the question, what is your company's position on testing for marijuana? 73% said they plan to continue testing for marijuana. 3% said they're considering dropping it in the next 12 months. 12% said they have dropped marijuana from their panel, and 12% are not sure what to do. Now, again, let's go back in time, even 10 years, not even 20 years ago, but 10 years ago, it would have been 93% would have said we plan to continue testing for marijuana. But the legalization of marijuana in so many places across the country has started to have a negative impact on employers' decision about testing for marijuana. I've got a book coming out through the Current Consulting Group very soon called What Every Employer Should Know About Marijuana. And we make the case that you really should test for marijuana. And one of the sections, one of the chapters of the book is on state laws and marijuana testing. And it may be surprising to many people to learn that testing for marijuana is really permitted in every state. There are states that have enacted restrictions that have made it harder for employers to conduct testing for marijuana. New York is a perfect example. And if you ask many people in the drug testing industry, is it legal to test for marijuana in New York? Almost all of them would say no, but there are some loopholes in that Department of Labor law in the state of New York that creates a pathway to test under certain circumstances where reasonable suspicion exists. But the point is that you should have a program in place that protects you as a company from the negative effects of individuals being at work under the influence of marijuana. So even if you're not testing for marijuana, you should have a section of your policy that prohibits employees, and it states very clearly that employees may not bring marijuana into the workplace, they may not use marijuana while on the job, and they may not be impaired or under the influence of marijuana while working. And so your policy has to state that very clearly. And again, you have to take into account as you're writing your policy, or you're having somebody write your policy for you, any state law restrictions that may apply, so that you're not putting together in place a law that, or excuse me, a policy where you really couldn't enforce it, or it's not legally compliant because you didn't take into effect the individual state laws that would apply to your company. Let's say you're in New York, right? You don't want to base your marijuana section for your entire company all over the country on what's required or restricted in New York. So you're going to have an individual addendum for New York when it comes to marijuana. Now, does the policy clearly explain prohibited conduct and consequences? And we talked a little bit about that when it comes to marijuana, but you have to explain very clearly in your policy, and this may require some updating on a regular basis depending on changes to state laws that apply to you, but which prohibited substances and behaviors are part of the policy, on duty and off duty considerations, consequences for refusals or drug test cheating efforts or positive results or other violations of the policy. Those have to be written into the policy So when the company takes some type of adverse employment action, it was in the policy, employees were educated on the policy's content, and they knew that this behavior was a violation of the policy and subject to some type of adverse employment action. If it's not in the policy, if you can't show it in writing, then you're in a very vulnerable position as an employer. And as I mentioned, you want to update your policy on a regular basis because there could be changes to the state laws that apply to you, and you want the policy to be up to date if and when it does occur that some type of adverse employment action is justified. Now, that last bullet's very important. Let's say that somebody does violate the policy. One of the things there in the third bullet, do you want to allow them to have a second chance opportunity or a return to duty type program? This is commonly, used in a DOT policy where return to duty testing may apply to somebody who tested positive and has been away from work for some period of time, going through some type of treatment or counseling program with a substance abuse professional. And maybe there's some additional follow-up testing after the person comes back to work for some period of time, again, based on the recommendation of your substance abuse professional, your SAP. And if you're giving somebody the opportunity to go through some type of return to duty program, you want that explained very clearly in your policy so there are no misunderstandings if the person then again violates the policy by using drugs at work or testing positive, etc. They know that after their return to duty and follow-up testing period, the policy of the company applies to them. And if they violate it, they could lose their employment. And that needs to be reflected in the policy. And a lot of that takes place when you're training supervisors and educating employees on what's expected of them, what kind of behavior is prohibited, etc. So the training is usually what we call reasonable suspicion or signs and symptoms training for supervisors. So not only are they trained in what's in the policy, but also what type of behavior could possibly indicate somebody's been using drugs or is on the job under the influence of drugs. And the employee training, we sometimes call it employee drug education, explains the effects of drug abuse in the workplace and how harmful it can be to them and potentially what the consequences might be for them if they violate the company policy. All of this is designed to protect your employees as you strive to keep a safe work environment for everyone, but also to let people know what's expected in case anything comes up that may affect their employment with the company. It's all in the policy. It's all been documented because your training records are documented as well. And when employees go through the employee drug education program and are given either a copy of the policy or they're shown where they can access the policy, that's all documented so that nobody can come back and say, I didn't know. Now, let's conclude by reviewing once again the 7 main things we talked about in today's presentation. Have you reviewed the applicable state laws and federal regulations lately, hopefully within the last year? Does your policy clearly define testing objectives? Are covered employees clearly identified? Does the policy reflect current testing methods? Are marijuana provisions current and legally defensible? Does the policy clearly explain prohibited conduct and consequences? And is training addressed, and does it align with the policy language and the objectives of the company? So finally, in that first bullet there, an up-to-date policy really is the foundation of a compliant and an effective program. Your policy says what it is you expect of your employees and what possible consequences may apply, as well as explains how you'll conduct drug testing, when you'll conduct drug testing, who drug testing applies to. And you want to review that regularly. See your policy as a living document that gets updated regularly as applicable laws and regulations change, so that at any given point, your policy is in compliance with the laws that apply to it. So at least review it every year, but if not on a regular basis throughout the year, to make sure that you're in compliance with all the various laws that apply to you. So if you need help reviewing or updating your drug testing policy, that's what we do here at the Current Consulting Group. We can help you with that. And if you want to know state drug testing laws that apply to you, as I mentioned, We have a state law database called Current Compliance that you can subscribe to, where you have access to all the laws in every state that affect workplace drug testing. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and thank you for attending. Greta, do we have any questions today?
Bill, actually, we do. We have a couple. The first one, the question is, are there any states that prohibit testing for marijuana?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are states that appear to prohibit testing for marijuana, but when you look very closely, they all allow some circumstances that would allow or permit an employer to conduct drug testing for marijuana. The thing that you'll find in many states, however, is there are restrictions on what you can do with a positive result, anti-discrimination language. So it's very important that you review every state marijuana that applies to every state marijuana law that applies to your company, and then make sure that your policy is updated, especially if new law gets passed or amendments are passed or to modify an existing law. Make sure that you update your policy to reflect those and that it's always in compliance.
And we do have one more. Can we refuse to hire applicants who test positive?
Well, that again depends on each state law that applies to you. There are states that have restrictions on, for example, you're not prohibited to refuse to hire, excuse me, let me rephrase that. You're prohibited from refusing employment to someone who tests positive for marijuana if they're a registered medical marijuana user. Nevada is an example of that. Now, there may be some leeway that you have in terms of what jobs you have to hire them to do, safety sensitive versus non-safety sensitive, but there are some states that prohibit employers from discriminating against job applicants who are registered medical marijuana users. So again, the answer to that question depends on the state. Make sure you review the state laws that apply to your company and that your policy reflects any restrictions that apply, so that at all times you're in compliance, regardless of where in the country your employees or your supervisors or managers are hiring people. They're always in compliance because the policy has been updated to reflect each individual state law that applies to you.
Thank you, Bill. And let's go ahead and just wrap this up. And thank you, everyone, joining us today for today's edition of Current in 30. We hope these insights help you stay informed and confident in your workplace drug screening decisions. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions in a few days informing you how to access the recording via email. Additionally, this presentation qualified for half of a professional development credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attended today's presentation in its entirety. If you have met that requirement, you will be emailed the activity IDs. Remember, we'll be back every second and fourth Monday of 2026 with things you need to know to stay current in this industry. Be sure to follow the Current Consulting Group and check your inbox for upcoming session details. Until next time, stay current and have a great day.